Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, taking a look at some of their super cool prototype M1 Garand rifles. And today, we are taking a look at the T20 project. Now, this is essentially the final evolution of the M1 Garand, and it starts in September of 1944, when the Ordnance Committee of the U.S. Army recommends development of a new version of the M1. They had in mind an M1 that essentially could do everything. They wanted it magazine-fed, like 20-round BAR magazines. They wanted it selective fire, so it could be full auto. They wanted it to be able to mount a scope, and then they also had ideas to make a short-barreled folding stocked version as well, so that you had all of these capabilities for paratroopers. Now, as far back as 1942, John Garand had already experimented with adapting the BAR magazine to the M1 Garand, which kind of sounds like it would make a lot of sense. There are reasonable reasons why the US government opted for the 8-round en bloc clip in the M1, and that's beyond the scope of today's video. But Garand had tinkered with a lot of things, including BAR mags. Now, what he had found is that the BAR magazine does not feed fast enough to cycle in an M1 Garand action. The problem is the BAR magazine is designed for the BAR, which shoots fairly slowly. It tops out at 500-600 rounds a minute. And so the magazine can be kind of sluggish and still feed just fine for a BAR. You put that in an M1 Garand, well, the rate of fire is a good deal higher. The bolt takes a lot less time to cycle back and forth, and the bolt will come forward before a round in the BAR magazine has come far enough up to feed. That's a problem. But it's a problem that Garand had already started tinkering with. So when they got the order in September of '44 to start working on this project, it only took a month before they had the first rifle actually ready for testing here at Springfield. So October of '44, it's ready at Springfield. They do some test shooting with it. November of '44, the T20 goes to Aberdeen Proving Ground for more serious testing. And this is the T20. So it's an M1. They had adapted a BAR magazine to it with a little bit of clutching. They'd given it a muzzle brake to help control recoil and climb in full auto. And then, of course, they had given it a full auto capability. Using the exact same system that would be used in the M14 14 years later at this point. Now, one of the really interesting things here is this is a system that was actually, it fired from an open bolt in full auto and from a closed bolt mostly in semi-auto. So let's take a look at what the T20 rifle really was. All right, let's start with the receiver markings here. This is US Rifle Caliber 30 T20. Number 1, this is the first one made. Now, let's look at features. Let's start at the front. So first up, we have what they call the recoil check, the muzzle brake that they fitted on this thing, a little crudely welded. I suspect that was repaired after it probably blew off once or twice. But the idea is you get some gas venting here upwards to help keep the muzzle down, and some of the muzzle blast is going to deflect off of this backwards, which pulls the rifle forward, which helps control recoil. However, that is also going to make this probably pretty unpleasantly loud for the guy shooting it. Now, for the US Army in World War II, if you want a magazine-fed M1, there's really only one magazine to work with. Rather than reinvent the wheel, you've got the BAR magazine. It's 30-06, it's the same caliber, it's been in service for decades at this point. It's a good magazine. Use this. Well, as I said, Garand knew that this magazine wasn't going to cycle fast enough. It didn't feed fast enough to run a full auto M1. And so his solution to that was actually to lengthen the receiver of the M1 by 3/8 of an inch. That doesn't sound like much, but it's just enough extra travel to to slow down the cycling of the bolt, so the magazine has enough time to feed a cartridge. Now, he also made a couple of adjustments to this magazine. If we look in here, you can see the design of the feed lips has been pretty substantially changed, basically just to work better in the M1 platform. There's an over-travel stop that's been brazed on here. And I don't know if you saw it when I pulled this out, but the magazine catch on this rifle is a pull back and then extract the magazine out sort of thing. So it's a straight feed into the gun locks in place using the original M1 BAR magazine catch to pull it out, pull that back, and pull the thing down. This doesn't drop free, but this is also prototype number 1. Now, before we take this apart, I do want to demonstrate the fire modes. So we have a selector lever back here. This is the rifle that this fire selector system originates on. It will go on to be on the M14 in basically exactly this form. And it's essentially just a kludge. So the idea is you have this external bar. If you're in full auto, when the bolt closes, as long as you're holding the trigger down, you've got this bit of travel of the operating rod where the bolt's locked in place. And this just gives you a little bit of dwell time when the system's opening. So the op rod starts moving and the bullet has time to leave the barrel, pressure has time to drop a little bit before it starts to rotate and unlock the bolt. Well, Garand, being a clever guy, realizes he can use this extra space going the opposite direction. And in full auto, in fact, I can just show this to you. If I put this in full auto, so I'm holding the trigger down here, but the hammer hasn't dropped because the disconnector is preventing it from happening. When this gets to its very front end of travel, it's going to hit this bar and push it forward. You can see that moved forward just a little bit right there. That released the hammer to fire. So it's essentially an external auto trip. If I push this button in and rotate it around to semi-auto, it essentially just locks this out of position and the gun fires in semi-auto. Now, on the T20 specifically, when it's in full auto mode, it fires from an open bolt. So this isn't a magazine hold open. I can take the magazine out and the bolt locks open every time when I pull it back. In full auto, if I hold the trigger down, it's going to go forward. That trip's going to fire it. It's going to come back. And it's just going to continue to fire like this from the open bolt until I release the trigger. Fires, and then locks open again. If I switch this over to semi-auto, what's interesting is this is actually going to modify the trigger group, or the behavior of the trigger group a little bit. My first shot will be in from an open bolt, but again, I'm holding the trigger down. Now it overrides that bolt locking open, and the bolt's going to close. But as you can see through here, the hammer hasn't dropped yet. When I release the trigger, you can hear it reset. And then when I pull it again, there goes the hammer, gun fires, and it fully cycles. So my next semi-auto round will be from a closed bolt. So really kind of a clever, fairly simple way to do the combination of full auto from an open bolt and semi-auto from a closed bolt. Now, let's go ahead and pull this apart. It disassembles just like an M1 because, I mean, fundamentally, it is an M1. So there's our trigger group. Note that it does not have the floor plate extension forward like on a regular M1. That's because, of course, we have a box magazine well here. And then the action just comes right off the stock. So if we compare this, we have our T20 here and a regular M1 Garand here. You can see they're fundamentally extremely similar. The feed system has changed. So this infrastructure in here to feed M1 clips is gone. Instead, these wings are essentially now the internal magazine well. The recoil spring is just hooked under a pin right there instead of also having to double as the feed spring because, of course, on a box magazine, you have a separate feed spring in the magazine itself. This lug has been added onto the back of the receiver to allow, to fit these full auto features onto. And then, like I mentioned, the receiver has actually been lengthened by 3/8 of an inch. And you can see that here. It's a bit subtle, but I line these guys up and you can see that the T20 receiver here is just a little bit longer than the M1 Garand receiver, 3/8 of an inch specifically. If we look at the T20 stock, first off, you can see that metal reinforcing for the magazine well there. And then you can very clearly see the extension for the receiver here. The inside milling is exactly the same. The overall length of the stocks are exactly the same, but the wrist has been shortened just a bit here to give you this extra bit of space for the bolt to travel inside the receiver. And of course you have a cutout for the selector switch. When Aberdeen Proving Grounds did its testing in November of '44, it found a lot of shortcomings in the T20. The gun had too much recoil, too much blast, too much concussion. It still climbed too much. There were problems with overheating. You know, the M1 wasn't designed for full auto, and adapting it to full auto led to a lot of these problems. So the barrel wasn't heavy enough. The gas system wasn't really designed for full auto and heat dispersion and dealing with the heat there. Semi-auto 8-round clips is a lot different in practice than 20-round full auto magazines. So at this point, by the way, the ideas, the plans for a short-barreled folding stock version, those go out the window. I think people realize that that's not a viable option. You know, they have enough problems controlling this thing in its full-length 24-inch barrel guise. Doing it with a tanker-length barrel ain't gonna happen. Side note, tankers were never used for tanks. That's a whole separate issue. But this leads to development of the T20E1. And conveniently, we have a T20E1 right here. This is serial number 7. The Ordnance Department ordered, after the testing of the T20, they come up with the problems and make some plans to fix these problems in the next iteration. That's the E1. They order 10 T20E1s. Those guns are ready for testing in January of '45. So it only takes a couple months. But they actually made a significant number of changes to this. So for one, they introduced a roller bearing to the bolt lug. This is another feature that would go on to be used in the M14, and it originates right here in January of 1945. They also scrapped the open bolt firing thing. This reverts to just a closed bolt only gun. They add a scope mount system to the side of the receiver, which never actually gets used in the T20 project, but it is one of the capabilities that Army Ordnance wants in the gun. That also is a feature that would go on to be used in almost identical form in the M14. There's so many elements of the M14 that exist in this rifle. And then they redesigned the magazine because they want to be able to lock the bolt open. And so they actually there is no magazine hold open in the receiver. They just have the gun lock open on the back of the magazine follower, much like there are a few AK magazines that do this, the Yugoslav AK mags, where the gun will lock open when the mag's empty, and as soon as you pull the mag out, the bolt slams forward. So since we have a T20E1 here, let's take a closer look at its details. We'll start with the receiver markings once again. This is now US Rifle Caliber 30 T20E1, Springfield Armory. This is example number 7. The muzzle brake design at the front is essentially the same as on the T20, but this is now a more professionally manufactured part. You can see this is milled as one nice piece, as opposed to being rather crudely welded together or welded back together like on the original T20. They've clearly had an opportunity to do some work here and improved the manufacturing for that. One of the biggest changes here is that a new magazine has now been developed for the rifle. This is still based on the BAR. Like you can see the similarities here, but there's some changes that have been made. So the most visibly distinctive, the front of the magazine has been stepped in a little bit. The feed lips are actually more similar to the BAR than on the original T20 magazines. And this now has an exposed flat rear section of the follower. So this is, by the way, now a nose-in rock-back magazine. Again, like the M14. The magazine catch has been improved though, so now you can grab the magazine and you push the magazine button in to release the mag, where on the original T20s you had to push it back and then pull the magazine out somehow. So that goes in like that, and it now locks open on the back of the magazine follower. So the good news there is when the magazine's empty, the rifle will lock open. The bad news is when you take the mag out to reload it, the bolt slams shut. You then have to put a new magazine in and rack the bolt manually. However, this is also now a closed bolt firing gun. Full auto, semi-auto, it's always closed bolt firing, which is probably an improvement. It's definitely a bit simpler. and makes for more accurate shooting. It's easier to get good shots from a closed bolt than when after you pull the trigger, but before the shot releases, you have this big weight slamming forward. We can disassemble this. There we go. All right, so here's the fire control group out of the T20E1. Note that on the original T20, we have this extra guy up here, which is what allows it to fire from an open bolt. That is no longer in place, so we've simplified the fire control group, moved it back more towards the standard M1 system. We have a number of modifications to the receiver. We no longer have the long original wings held over from the M1 Garand. This has been trimmed down. That's going to help reduce weight because you really don't need all of that material. And a scope mounting base essentially has been added to the side of the receiver. You got one screw hole and a mounting line there. They never did do scopes on the T20s, but this will be held over to the M14. Note that despite these changes, they're still essentially just using a lengthened M1 Garand receiver to manufacture these. You can see in here, as along with the rest of these receiver changes, we now have a spring retainer here. So I have to push this pin over like that. Then I can pull the mainspring out. If you've ever taken apart an M14, you've seen that system too. One additional element you will recognize from the M14 is the addition of a roller bearing here on the bolt, and that was done to improve reliability. This is a feature that was actually the subject of separate M1 developmental experimentation. So they added that at the T1 or T20E1 stage. When Aberdeen does its testing on the T20E1, it's better. It still has issues, and there are a couple specific things that they decide they want to tweak. One of them is the muzzle device. The recoil check, as they call it, on the 20 and the 20E1 is decent, but one of its shortcomings is you can't put muzzle devices on it. You can fit a bayonet, but not a rifle grenade launcher, and that's a capability that they wanted. You can see the idea here of like the universal service rifle that can do anything. It can be the rifle, it can be a grenadier's launcher, it can be a sniper's weapon. You'll see that in a lot of countries around the world. The French would actually adopt a rifle that fit all of those criteria in 1949, right about the same time this is getting developed. And it wasn't just the French. The Americans were interested in that concept too. So they wanted a more universal, more like a muzzle device with more features to it. And they didn't necessarily like that bolt hold open on the back of the magazine follower. They wanted a way to be able to lock the bolt open manually at the minimum. So that leads to the recommendation for the T20E2, and we also have one of those. All right, this thing's longer grenade launching muzzle device meant I had to actually zoom the camera out just a little bit to fit it in. So with the testing complete on the T20E1, these changes are specified, and now the order for T20E2s is up to 100. So it was one or just a couple of the first guns, 10 of the E1s, now 100 of the E2s. We're getting close to the final form of this rifle. The first of these guns would be ready for testing in June of 1945, but even before that happens, just 9 days after the surrender of Nazi Germany, the Ordnance Committee recommends manufacture of 100,000 T20E2s and adoption of the rifle to replace the standard M1 Garand. At this point, there's still a lot of fighting to be done in the Pacific. There is this expectation, reasonable expectation, that the US is going to have to do an amphibious invasion of Japan, and there are elements of the Army that think it'd be a really good idea to have this new, more capable select fire rifle in the hands of every GI. Like magazine feed, more capacity, full auto, increase the amount of firepower in the GI's hands. So recommendation for 100,000 of them in April of 1945. So like I said, testing, they're able to begin testing on the guns in June, and these things still have problems. So they've fixed all the issues, the specific feature issues that have come up, but they still have problems, particularly with muzzle blast and with climb on full auto, which is not surprising. This is the same form factor as the M14, which would always have issues with climb in full auto. The form factor on this rifle with a dropped traditional stock, the muzzle's above the point on the shoulder, this just leads to the gun climbing in full auto. And they've done a lot of R&D work on muzzle brakes to try and help control this, and it's helped, but it hasn't solved the problem. There still also continue to be issues with overheating. They have a hard limit on the weight of the gun that restricts how heavy the barrel can be, and it's just kind of a physics issue of that barrel gets hot. You got a wooden handguard, the handguards are going to catch fire, the barrels start, you get heat stresses in the barrels, your accuracy goes downhill. These are problems they were never able to fundamentally solve on this system. Frankly, they really weren't able to fundamentally solve them on the M14 either 15 years, 10 years later. So testing began in June. The last of the 100 rifles wasn't actually finished until December of 1945. And in between there, the idea of ordering 100,000 of them gets scrapped because, of course, Japan surrenders. The atomic bomb is leveraged for a Japanese surrender. There's no amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands required. There's no perceived need now to actually re-equip everybody with a brand new gun. So the T20E2 remains in testing. It remains an experimental design, and they will use it to continue to experiment with, mostly with muzzle device design for another couple years. This actually stays in play until 1949 when it's finally pretty much put to bed. But this forms the basis for what will become the T44, which is adopted as the M14. As you've seen, many of these features work their way into the M14. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's take a closer look at the T20E2. I can show you how all this muzzle device stuff works and their new manual hold open. Looking at the markings, once again, we are now at US Rifle Caliber 30 T20E2, made by Springfield Armory, and this is serial number 98, so one of the last ones that was made. Mechanically, this is essentially the same gun as the E1 pattern. They've just made some exterior changes. So one of them is the addition of this little lever on the top. Actually, I should point out one of the things that was on the M14 that did not make it into T20 development was a stripper clip guide. So these were intended to be reloaded only with new magazines, not topped up with stripper clips. Anyway, this exists as a manual hold open. So the T20E2 is using the same magazine as the E1 with the flat rear of the follower. So it's going to lock open like so when the magazine's empty, but this will just drop when you remove the magazine unless you pull the handle back and manually drop that little lug down. Now I can pull the magazine out and the bolt stays open. It's a really simple system. It's just a physical blocking lever up here on top. Pull the bolt back a little bit, snap that forward, and the bolt will close as normal. So the rifle still has no automatic hold open, but it does now have a kind of finicky to use manual hold open. Then we go out to the muzzle, and you can see the muzzle device here is basically the same. You've got two big ports, you've got a shield on the front, but now you've got this extra spigot for launching rifle grenades. You've got gas checks there, you've got the little spring to put some tension on the grenade so it doesn't fall off if the rifle tips down. This is a removable piece, so if I push this lever in just slightly, I can rotate it 90 degrees, pull this off. Now you can see the bare muzzle device itself, so they've kind of gotten rid of the flat shield if you're not launching grenades. But you've still got the two big ports opening up and to the sides. And we have a distinct new gas plug. So this is what allows grenades to be launched safely. One of the issues with launching rifle grenades in general is you tend to have way more recoil on the system from the grenade, and normally the bullet would clear the muzzle and all the pressure would vent out, and that drastically reduces pressure on your gas system. With the grenade takes a lot longer to launch than a bullet does, and it's going to retain gas inside the barrel, pressure stays high, and you end up with very high op rod and bolt velocities that will damage the rifle. So what we have here is a gas vent plug on the front of the gas system. So the gas port comes down here. This is just open. When you put this plug on normally, it seals the gas system. But if I push on the front of it here, it opens basically like the piston in an engine. And opening like that allows gas to vent right out the front of this through these holes. Now you might ask, if gas is going this way, what on earth is going to push that plunger in the opposite direction? The answer is the grenade launcher itself is going to. So if we mount this on, when it fires, the recoil is going to push it back like so. And you can see right here, it's compressing. This shield is compressing that plunger. So as soon as the grenade starts to move, gas vents out of the system and thus prevents dangerous overpressure. I should also mention one of the really clever elements of the T20 E1 and E2 magazine is that this magazine will actually fit and function in a BAR. Now you can't put a BAR in the T20 series guns, not in the E1 and E2, because the front of the magazine on them is narrowed down, but this narrower magazine will fit in a BAR. So in theory, in combat, you would be equipping all of the riflemen with their own rifle magazines, but they could still resupply their BAR gunner if they needed to. All right, so those are the three stages of the Springfield Armory T20 project. It is worth pointing out here that there was another rifle also developed at the same time to do the exact same thing, a mag-fed select fire conversion of the M1, because rather than put all of their eggs in just the Springfield basket, the Ordnance Department in late '44 also signed a contract with Remington to develop this same thing to see which would end up being better. The Remington gun was the T22, and we will cover that in a separate video. So that's just way too much material for this one. So as I said earlier, the T20 development kind of peters along until 1949, and ultimately this forms the basis for most of the features of the M14. It's kind of a little bit interesting that it took another 8 years after the complete end of the T20 program before the M14 is actually adopted, despite being basically this gun. It's the only real difference is in the gas system, and that gas system is something that was being developed on the M1 during World War II as well. It just took a little time to get it integrated with the T20 system. So I'd like to give a very hearty thanks to the Springfield Armory National Historic Site for giving me access to their reference collection where we could pull out all three of these rifles to show to you guys on camera. If you find yourself in Springfield, Massachusetts, definitely take the time to stop by their museum. They have a really cool exhibit of all sorts of small arms, particularly US military arms, particularly a bunch of developmental and trials guns, including this original #1 T20 rifle, which is on display in the museum. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.